Here we go. Larry Weaner, the king of meadow. That's what I understand.
Okay. Not for me to say one way or the other. Pleasure to be invited, and really enjoyed the first few presentations. And so I'm going to jump right into this thing because I want to be substantive and get to the end, which is difficult sometimes for me. So I'm talking about planning for the unplanned, integrating ecological restoration techniques in landscape design. And I'm going to really talk specifically a lot about ecological process, not just using native plants and using them in the similar habitats to which they are accustomed to naturally occur. But I want to talk about how things change in nature and how we can incorporate plant compositions change over time in nature. They are not static. In a garden, typically we come up with a palette of plants and we arrange them on a plan and we plant them in that arrangement and we weed everything else in between. And the intent is for those plants to thrive, grow bigger, form some type of composition. Can be a beautiful, well-done composition. But in that respect, it's difficult to call it natural, even if it's native plants. Because if you walk out in the woods and inventory the species that are in a certain spot and come back in 10 years, some things will have dropped out, some new things will be there, some things will still be there in more numbers and less numbers. So there's a dynamism in terms of compositional change that occurs in nature in almost all cases, if not all cases. Yet that isn't part of landscape design. And when it is, it's kind of happenstance and not really something that we are necessarily aware of, managing, or influencing. So planning for the unplanned, ecological restoration techniques in landscape design, understand ecological processes of change and incorporate them into design, planting, and management protocols. That can be something that, sounds good, but what the heck does that really mean and how do we do it? I'm going to get very literal here and talk about some of this stuff. And to lay the groundwork, I want to show a picture that may not seem to make sense for a native design person in the eastern United States to talk about. This is a picture in Yosemite National Park of a meadow and in California. And, you may look at that landscape, and if that landscape would have existed prior to European disturbance of the landscape and the management practices of Native Americans, you might have assumed, well, that's the landscape that nature put there. However, what's now been learned, and this has been studied extensively in California, but it appears to be the case on some level pretty much throughout North America, that the entire landscape was manipulated by Native Americans. And that basically the landscape in California that the first Europeans laid eyes on and assumed was just a naturally occurring landscape, and the Native Americans were out there collecting berries and farming little plots and hunting, but not affecting that composition was not true. They were burning huge areas, they were moving plants around, they were disturbing soil. There's a book called Tending the Wild by M. Cat Anderson, a recently retired ethnobotanist with the University of California, Berkeley, I believe. And she writes extensively and has researched extensively what they did in the landscape prior to disturbance, displacement of their lifestyle and management techniques. And it's fascinating, it really is. I'm not going to go into that specifically, but the point is, this thing that we call nature and these gardens that we call human are not really that different. Nature is not what we see out there, and certainly not anymore. Even more so than when the Native Americans were operating on their own here. Everything has been influenced by people. So this idea of let's go back to this composition, this pre-European colonization composition that was the right stuff that we should go back to. Do we need to understand that as best we can? Yes. Do we want to incorporate much of that as we're designing? Yes. I'm not advocating discarding it, but getting that landscape back as the dominant composition on properties that we work and natural areas ain't going to happen because that condition doesn't exist anymore. So what that means is this stuff like what Patrick is talking about on the High Line and some of the discussion that occurred earlier, these are new landscape compositions. And the more we understand the native landscape composition, the better we can do it. But that does not mean we have to be a slave to the native landscape composition. So I'm going to talk about some of the strategies. And really, it can come down to a very simple thing. Here's the base of a stone wall. It's along a path between that wall and a meadow. And it's mowed. The management of this landscape is the meadow gets mowed once a year. That would be to my back. You'll see it in the next image. And up to the wall. However, a couple springs after planting the meadow, I requested the mowing crew, and I flagged it so it would actually happen, to leave an 18-inch swath unmown at the edge, at the base of the wall. And for a growing season, they left that. And later in the growing season, I walked that stretch, and I inventoried what was going on along the stretch. And there were areas where it was weedy, and there may be a meadow plant coming in, but it was mostly plants I would consider undesirable. And then there were places where cool stuff was happening. So the next step for me was to put a little semicircular flag around the areas that I wanted to remain unmown vegetation, or once a year mown vegetation, as the meadow would be. And basically said, okay, go back to mowing against the wall, except go around the flags. And then once there was a difference in height, then the flags come out, and that's our landscape. And that could be done on a yearly basis, or repeat it, or however you want to manage it. So here you're seeing some Rudbeckia laciniata coming up, and there were different areas where I flagged. And this was one of them, and this wasn't even a meadow plant. That's an elderberry that was being mowed. But basically, so the idea here isn't just let it go. In this case, it was let it go, observe the results, keep what you like, and go back to mowing the rest. And this is the simplest thing in the world, as long as you can identify the plants. There were two criterion for where I was going to mark off the no-mow zones. One was the most desirable vegetation, but there were a lot of places where there was desirable vegetation, and I didn't want this strip of meadow along the whole wall, it's just from an aesthetic standpoint. So the second criteria was, as a designer, what is a graceful distribution of these patches? I don't want 17 of them all clustered right here and then nothing, and 2 all the way down there. I wanted to have not a perfectly symmetrical, although I could have said I wanted it to be perfectly symmetrical, to run counter to this whole wild 40-acre meadow landscape that it was within. Or I could make it more in line spatially with the meadow and have them be spatially irregular. So again, this is designing years after the landscape was planted. And one of the key points that I would like to make here, and management, Patrick also mentioned, the importance of it, and I'll absolutely agree with him 1,000%, that planning in this kind of landscape particularly, where you're not weeding everything between the plants, or mowing everything between the plants, or outside of the beds, basically, that is kind of able to be done by pretty much anybody. When you get into this stuff, management is really, the design does not end when the plants go in. That design switches into management, but design still is happening long term. It's a very different type of approach. And if I talk that long about every image, I'll get through about 10% of this, so I'm gonna move. So this is that meadow. This is from the house, looking at the house. This is 40 acres, and basically, you can't treat 40 acres like you treat a garden bed. You have to have plants doing much of the work for you from a management standpoint. You have to rely on plants proliferating in the landscape post-planting in order to fill these spaces. And so you really have to start thinking differently. You start to have to understand ecological process and do big picture manipulations that kind of steer the landscape in a certain direction. When you weed a landscape, if a crew goes in there and they pull every weed and then they leave, the weeding job is done. A lot of the things about that I will illustrate here are things that slowly change the landscape. The first time this activity occurs, all the weeds are not gone. The activity is intended to favor the desirable species over the weeds, and as that activity repeats and plays out, you eventually get to a goal. And that's a really different kind of thing. So we're talking about plant proliferation and the ability for the plants that you plant, be they from seed or live plants, to be able to proliferate and increase in numbers in the landscape. And actually, this is this landscape shortly after seeding, and you're seeing Indian paintbrush just coming in. First plants, they were planted in patches, not throughout the landscape. And this is one of the patches, and there's a few plants, and they're small. And on the bottom, I say here, defining whether a plant is successful in the landscape is different from an ecological standpoint than a horticultural standpoint. An ecologist defines a plant as successful in the landscape if it increased in numbers. A horticulturist considers successful if the plant you planted is there and healthy. So what I want to talk about here with this image is matching the plant to the habitat so it A, will survive, and B, it will have a higher likelihood of expanding or proliferating into the landscape. So you're looking at Indian paintbrush here. Now I'm in Northwest Connecticut. I don't live there. My house is in Glenside, Pennsylvania. This project is in Salisbury, Connecticut. And Indian paintbrush grows all over the Southwest. If you go to Texas in February, March, you may see acres and acres as far as the eye can see naturally occurring there. It is also a native plant in Connecticut. But unlike the Midwest, where soils are alkaline, there's other characteristics that are important too, but you have alkaline soils derived from limestone out there in the Southwest. You also have that in Connecticut, but only in isolated places. So yes, Indian paintbrush is native to Connecticut, but it's not going to grow successfully anywhere in Connecticut. It's going to grow successfully if you happen to be on a limestone vein, or if not, if you create that condition. Well, we're on a limestone vein here. So that means two things. The obvious thing is the plant will grow where it may not outside of its pH-oriented habitat type, soil type. But two, it is more likely to proliferate. It is more likely to produce viable seeds, and those seeds are more likely to be able to germinate in the landscape. So let's look at the patch thickening up, and then it starts to expand. And you can see a Baptisia australis coming in the middle of it. That wasn't planted there. That was planted in an adjacent area that had a slightly different soil hydrologic condition. So you see plants are now moving around. And this is one of the keys. It's unseen. You can't look at this landscape and say, oh, they're moving around because they're in the right habitat. You don't see that. You have to be analyzing that before you put the plants in. Here's a plant that went into the same landscape. It was in the seed mix, probably throughout the whole mix, as I recall. And this is purple prairie clover. This is a plant that's native to the upper Midwest. It's not native to Northwest Connecticut. And I could probably count the number of plants out in this 40-acre meadow that actually showed up. Now, that is not to say that a non-native plant cannot do well. We use non-native plants sometimes in these landscapes. In a meadow, in a large meadow, we may be sticking native. We may use some things from the upper Midwest or farther south. But the point is, there are plants that will do very well. And this one, I talked to Bill Carter from Prairie Moon Nursery out in Wisconsin, who we deal with sometimes, frequently, and really smart guy. And I said, you know, what's the deal with prairie clover? You know, we plant it and we'll get one here and one there, and it never seems to proliferate. And he said, oh my God, it's all over the place when we seed it. It's one of our real bedrock plants. Well, he's in the upper Midwest where that plant grows. There are other plants like Silphium perfoliatum, which was planted in this landscape, that is now on the invasive plant lists in Connecticut. This is a native plant to the upper Midwest. There are native, Silphium trifoliatum is an eastern native. But evidently that plant, and I've used it and seen that it does increase significantly. And not only that, it's 8 feet tall and forms these big, dense masses. So if it increases significantly, a significant number of individuals come up. Each one of those individuals is taking up a lot of real estate. And so, you know, it can be an issue. And there are non-native plants that do just fine. Echinacea purpurea is not native to where we plant it often. And it can be a perfectly good component, although I like Pallida much better that Patrick showed. And in fact, Echinacea atripurpurea, the purple coneflower, is really an edge plant. It's not an open meadow species. And I've observed it doing really, really well in woodland edges here. So the point is, there's no assumptions here. It's native, it's going to do great. It's non-native, it's going to be invasive. It's non-native, it won't grow. There's all kinds of different configurations. The point is, you need to get a deep understanding of these plants to be able to use them effectively, not slavishly, you know, be labeling things or calling this type of plant evil or that type not. Every plant's just trying to grow, I mean, really. So this is a question that you'll hear ecologists ask often when they're out in a landscape and looking at a place. They're not just inventorying what's there. They're saying, what's going on here? What led to this plant composition? Why is it here? What did it used to be? Where is it headed? What's going on here? Which implies you're at a point in time. You're not you're not looking at a static landscape. You're looking at a moment in time. You know, like a river. You can't see the same river twice. Well, you really can't see the same landscape twice. It's not as literal. Come back in 10 minutes, it's pretty much going to be the same landscape. But, and you know, this is a landscape of a gentleman that I have a great deal of admiration for and has influenced me a lot. His name was Frank Edler. He died in the 90s. He was an ecologist who was born in Norfolk, Connecticut. He was a very cantankerous individual, started off his career in the academic world. He would write scientific papers that read like rants, basically, and he just wasn't cut out for that world. But he was a brilliant man, ahead of his time, and he went back to his family's estate in Norfolk, Connecticut, named the place Seaton Forest, and from the 1940s until the 1990s when he died, and his work is continuing. He had a mentor, and there was an endowment, and his work is continuing at Seaton Forest. He basically did things to the landscape and observed the reaction on all kinds of different scales. And what you're looking at is one of the landscapes that he worked on, and it's pretty incredible because in the 40s, when Frank went back to this property, it was a hayfield. But he noticed that, particularly on the upper 2/3 of this slope, and it's about 7 acres, he noticed there were a lot of low dryland shrubs that had been mowed with the haying process, but were kind of forming an underlayment to the grass. Low bush blueberry, sweet fern, spreading juniper, that kind of thing. So he decided this was the inclination. This was a dry landscape, indicated by the type of shrubs that were there, that he didn't want to mow this anymore. But he had no use for a hayfield. So his idea was how can he preserve this as an open landscape without ever mowing it? You don't mow shrubs. You might mow it if it was an herbaceous landscape. If it was a meadow or a grassland, you might mow it once a year to get rid of any woody plants or to hold them back. In this case, he couldn't do that. His goal was a shrubland, and he was looking at his goal wasn't a shrubland because I think I would love a shrubland. His goal was, I see where this is headed based on the conditions here, and I'm going to ride that. And so what he did was he removed trees as they came up. And that was all he did. Now, he didn't need to do anything regarding the grass because once mowing favored the grass because it is an herbaceous perennial. Part of its life cycle is to die back and grow back, so it has the ability to grow back when it's lost its foliage, even though it's being mowed outside of the time that it might die back normally. A shrub, that's not part of a shrub's life cycle, is to be cut back and have to grow. So stopping mowing was going to favor the shrubs over the hay grasses. He didn't need to do anything for that to happen. But the process of succession was also going to have trees coming in, and that was going to turn it into a forest and shade the shrubs, and that's not what he wanted. He wanted to preserve it as open landscape. So what he did was he cut the trees as they came up, and he painted them with herbicide. Now, evidently, he was the first person to ever use herbicide as an ecological restoration tool. It was used in agriculture primarily. And an interesting thing about him was he was visited while he was doing this work by Rachel Carson when she was researching Silent Spring. And he's in her book as one of the few people that was using herbicide responsibly because all he was doing was painting stubs. Now here's what's the interesting and profound discovery that Frank made there. Profound in terms of how we operate in the landscape from a practical standpoint. What he found was when he first released this landscape from mowing, as he expected, the shrubs naturally started to take over from the grass, and many, many trees came in, and he had a lot of work. And Frank had no help. He was on his own. And basically, he was spending a lot of time cutting and painting trees. But as time went on, the number of trees that encroached became fewer and fewer and really drastically dropped. And at that time, in the 40s anyway, the process of succession as it was described by Clements and some of the early ecologists was this idea that, you know, the initial disturbance plants come in, and then birds are flying over and seeds are dropping in, and those plants are, woody plants and trees are coming in. Propagules are entering the system over time, and that's causing ecological succession as kind of a relay. Frank, who basically, that's called relay floristics. Frank was talking about initial floristic composition, and what he was saying is the vast majority of plants that come into a landscape were there from the early stages of disturbance. And that would make sense because the seeds or small seedling trees that had been being mowed were already there when he released it from mowing, so they started to grow. New seeds that are growing in, once it was a dense shrub thicket, new seeds that were dropping in were unable to germinate with any regularity. Of course, some will. But the germination rate of propagules that were dropped into there because of the competition of the shrub layer or any dense vegetative layer was causing the incursion to reduce dramatically. And what's pretty amazing about this image is, can we get the lights down or off? Probably you can just turn them off because it's not showing up that well with the lights right here. At any rate, the point is you can see woods in the background. Now the woods was also part of the hayfield, and that was the control part of Frank's experiment. And so what he did from the 1940s and still to today, he never mowed that 7-acre field, and he prevented it from ever reverting to woods. You would look at that and you'd say, it's just, it's natural shrubland, you know, it doesn't look like anybody really did anything. It's a highly manipulated landscape where he planted nothing, but he understood the trajectory and he knew what he wanted and what he didn't want. And so here's kind of a way to approach this that I find very useful in looking at any vegetative composition, naturally occurring or planted. Where is it headed if I do nothing? What of that trajectory do I consider desirable and undesirable? And it's not always the same on every place. What can I do to steer it towards the desirable? And then the last question, what can I add that will not naturally occur, that I can't get through that first 3-step process? Typical garden design starts with number 4. What do I want to put here? And then maybe starts to look at what may be naturally occurring that you can ride, so to speak, if at all. But here, it's like, what can I get out of this landscape based on the inclinations of the landscape itself? That doesn't mean I'm just giving up all control, but it does mean that I'm going to utilize free stuff to an extent. Maybe not really free because there's labor that goes into it, but so here's a landscape I was driving by on the way to meet a new client in the coastal plain in Maryland. And it looked like a pretty nice field. It was pretty big. I don't know, I remember it must have been 20, 30 acres, I would guess. But I noticed it looked like a pretty nice vegetative composition, so I just pulled over, got out, took a walk around and checked things out, and it was. It had all kinds of good stuff in there. I'm not going to go through it all. But the point was, I came across tree tubes. So these folks were planting trees in this field, and they were planting sweet gum trees. And you'll notice next to the tree tube is a sweet gum tree that's bigger than the tree in the tree tube. Now, I got to guess that when they planted that tree, that sweet gum was probably too little to be noticed. They wouldn't have planted a sweet gum tree next to 6 inches from an existing sweet gum tree. However, that existing one outperformed the one that was probably bigger than it when it was planted. But the real point I want to make here is if you understand the coastal plain landscape, in Maryland and in other areas of the coastal plain, if you abandon a field, you more times than not will get, in the right soil condition, will get a sweet gum thicket. And they'll be like 8 inches apart, like you can't walk through it. That's what happens in most cases. So if you understand that landscape, planting sweet gums is not really very productive. Maybe if you analyze the landscape and decided I wanted to plant Nyssa sylvatica and the seeds do not travel very far and the edge of the woods don't have any Nyssa sylvatica, that would be a plant to plant because it's not going to occur. Question number 4, what can I add that will not naturally occur? Sweet gum is not one of them. That will occur on its own. And in fact, the money or labor or time that whoever, and I have no involvement, I still have no involvement here, the money and labor that went into buying and planting trees would have been much better used getting rid of the multiflora rose and autumn olive. And there wasn't much of it when I walked through there, but there's going to be a lot of it someday if somebody didn't do anything about it. So being able to answer those questions, being able to analyze that situation and project forward is very valuable just from an efficiency standpoint. Don't do stuff that you could get for nothing or for minimal management. So here's a house that I happened to drive by, not good grammar, and obviously they love their lawn and they're going to keep it, and I don't know that I'd ever try to talk them out of it. However, if someone bought that house and decided that they didn't want to mow that much lawn, they could design all kinds of cool, fancy stuff, or they could take a look next door and see what is available naturally occurring, because I'm sure the situation is very much the same. And then this does not preclude other stuff. I mean, if they wanted the finest hybrid tea rose garden in the world, there is nothing wrong with that. Make the soil as you want it and do it, and understand you're going to have to do what you got to do to make roses work. There's nothing wrong with it. However, that big lawn area is not going to be a rose garden. It's not going to be a pachysandra bed, and it's not going to be, there's not much you could do with it that is within the typical horticultural realm other than plant grass. But there is, if you can understand ecological process and apply it. And here's just some of the compositions that are out there. So again, what's going on here? I took this picture. This is cardinal flower, naturally occurring patch. Al, could you give me like 15-minute sign or 10?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, which is probably 10 minutes ago. Oh, okay. How much time do I have? How much time do I have? Okay, good. So this is cardinal flower, naturally occurring in a swamp in New Jersey. I was taking a horseback ride with my daughter many years ago, and we didn't see any cardinal flower, and I came to this beautiful patch, and I just took a picture of it because it's a beautiful patch of cardinal flower, and we're talking about many years ago, probably 25. And I used the picture just to show cardinal flower, but literally I didn't understand what was going on here at the time. And at one point when I looked at this picture, I thought, you know, that cardinal flower is there. There's a tree that fell in the background. And you might assume the cardinal flower is there and not elsewhere because that's where the seed somehow got deposited. But I don't believe that's the case. The seed is probably throughout that swamp. And it occurred there because of a disturbance. When that tree came down, it created a sunlit gap, which tiny seeds that want to be on the surface and are activated by sunlight, which cardinal flower is, were likely activated by sunlight, as well as the removal of the vegetative composition that was probably suppressing those seeds from germinating, as well as roughing up the soil that's creating a seed bed. And if you went back there today, the cardinal flower, I'm sure, is gone, and that the more aggressive ferns and sedges that were around the perimeter that was undisturbed have probably reinvaded it. So it's an understanding of a plant. If you know cardinal flower in horticulture, the word on it is, oh, it's short-lived, it grows quick, it flowers, it's short-lived, but it's cool because it seeds itself around. Let's kind of analyze that a little bit. If it seeds itself around, why does it seed itself around and keep coming in the garden? And I'm saying it probably would have been competed out here, because in a garden we're weeding. And we often have space between the plants occupied by mulch. And even if we don't, when we pull weeds, we're creating disturbances. So if we have cardinal flower in the landscape producing seed, when you're weeding, you're creating disturbance, and that seed is continually germinating, and you continually have a turnover of new plants, even if the original ones die out because they're short-lived or outcompeted. But that's not our goal. Our goal is to prevent seed germination often, in a typical landscape in a bed, to prevent weeds, by dense vegetative cover. So if we have dense vegetative cover to prevent weeds from germinating, it's also going to prevent cardinal flower from germinating throughout the landscape. But we can get around that if we understand the ecological process that governs that plant. Here's a dense intermingled garden bed that's intended to suppress weeds as well as do the aesthetic things that were looked for, and there's cardinal flower in there. Well, I'd like the cardinal flower to stay. So the management strategy, and it's written in guidelines, is to go to each plant those two clumps of cardinal flower at the appropriate time of year when seed is dropping, and they're a big capsule with tiny seeds in. The capsules drop. The point is, create a disturbance with a rake immediately around that plant. You know that's where the seeds are. Don't disturb anywhere else because that's just an entry for weeds. Disturb where you know there is a high concentration of the plant that you want to germinate. That probably would take 2 minutes, 1 minute per plant, to just take a rake and disturb the soil and dislodge the vegetation around it a little bit. You know, that's just now you don't have to do that. It's an extra thing. You could also say, as at my house, let the cardinal flower fade out. That's its role. That's a choice. But the more you understand ecological process, the more you can implement strategies. So, designing with succession. The meadow stage of succession, and I'll go really quickly here. Picture of a black-eyed Susan, Rebecca heard it, dominated planted meadow. Here it is the next year, same spot, same time of year. What happened to the Rebecca heard it? It's a biennial. Leaves first year, flowered second year, which is the year that you're looking at. And if I walked to this meadow and had no role in it and never didn't know anything about it, and you said, how old's that meadow? I'd say 2 years, because it's a biennial that's dominating right now. Then what happened to all the seeds? When the meadow was planted, the soil was bare soil and a condition for seeds to germinate. Now, there's dense vegetation. And so the Rebecca Herta distributed thousands, millions of seeds probably, but they're only germinating very sporadically where there happens to be a gap now because they're suppressed by the perennial vegetation that is now starting to take over. The seed mix was designed according to a successionary process. Basically, they were short-lived. It's all planted at the same time, but the Rudbeckia was one of the first plants to express itself, and then coneflower and others, and the Baptisias, which take even longer, start coming in. You plant them all at the same time, but your planning is not just succession of bloom or what plant is adapted to this situation. It's I need to fill all of the temporal niches as this meadow is developing. Why? Because you need to you want plants that you want to see and wildlife can use as quickly as possible and as long as possible, but also weed suppression. If you only plant, meadow cam was all short-lived plants, so it faded out, the weeds took over, and that was that. You could go the opposite direction and make the same mistake. I'm going to create a seed mix of only really long-lived species that live for hundreds of years in the prairies. Those plants take years to get established to the point where they can be weed suppressive. So you may never get to that stage because you didn't put the short-lived species in there that they would develop with, and weeds could end up winning the battle and suppressing them. Here it is again, early stage landscape. You can see Coreopsis lanceolata, a perennial but a short-lived one, and then it all turns into other plants. And I'll move quickly. Newly seeded. This is a landscape in northwest Connecticut. Bony soil and no additions, no compost, no topsoil, no tilling, no nothing. Everybody wanted to do all kinds of stuff to it. This is probably the most diverse meadow on a large scale I've ever planted, and it's one of the worst soils I've ever planted a meadow in, and there's a relationship there. Because the poor soils are not allowing either weeds to be as aggressive, or, even more importantly, because you're controlling the weeds, you're actively going after them, but it's also limiting the more aggressive species in the mix from dominating and suppressing the less aggressive species in the mix because it's an infertile condition. Here's hawkweed, which wasn't even planted, as Patrick pointed out. It's not a native plant. It wasn't in our mix, but it came in. And some Leotris and some of the goldenrods and Allium cernum and Leotris spiccatum, or the wetland. And here you're looking at some of the great mountain mints. And over a long period of time, 7-8 years, Veronicastrum starts coming in. Queen of the Prairie, can't grow it from seed. I don't know that anybody that ever has, so live plants were put in patches in this case. Veronicastrum came in from seed. And here, taking the client into the meadow is really where at least as much of the experience, the positive experience is, because that's where you get to see the intricacy. In these meadows, butterflies grow to the size of hawks, as you can see here. Some kind of optical illusion. I would say I'm a great photographer and I created the illusion. I am not. It was just an accident. And you can see kind of this is the cool, one of my favorite meadow pictures, and it's far from the most floriferous, knock your socks off flower picture, but you can start to see, here's a meadow that's, I don't remember when I took this, but it's got to be 12, 15 years old at least. And you can start to see these plants are very gracefully knitting together. They don't look like they're competing. They've sorted things out. That early Rudbeckia thing is almost, when I showed you a sea of Rudbeckia, that's almost like a Velvet Elvis compared to a Chagall or something, or a Monet, you know. It's nice and the client's happy because there's lots of flowers, but when you get to this stage where the plants have really sorted themselves out, that's when it's really cool. There's the Velvet Elvis. Anyway, you need Velvet Elvis, though, in the early stages because clients have to hang their hat on something. And here you have, I won't get into it because I don't have time, but this is fringe gentian that came in on its own after 12, 15 years. I think it was the same time I took. 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. I already talked about that. And I already talked about that. That's the cup plant that is a native to the upper Midwest and is now on the invasive species list in Connecticut. It wasn't when I planted it. And here's an interesting thing. What you're seeing in the foreground is not the meadow I planted. The meadow I planted is beyond that tree on the left. And all the open gappy areas in the forest around this meadow, 10, 12, 15, this meadow's 20 years old now, are starting to show up with meadow species that are expanding out from the meadow. Significant numbers of them, and I have a whole series I could show of Baptisia australis and this and that and the other. I'm not going to do it, but you can see the meadow is actually expanding, and there's art. You know, there's the Seaton. That sitting area was put there because of the view, and that swath of Indian grass was planted in a monocultural drift, placed on the slope so that it kind of reflected the different angles of the hills beyond, and underlined that view from that bench. And so even though this is a 40-acre wild place, there's still design that's going into it in that and many other ways. Oldfield Shrubland Stage, as I mentioned before, at Frank Egler's place. Oh, by the way, his book is The Wild Gardener and the Wild Landscape by Warren Kenfield. For some reason, he used what do you call it, pseudonym? I don't know why he did that, but he did. And the only place you can get it is at Connecticut College in New London, Connecticut, because they produced it, and I don't think it's on Amazon or anything. Anyway, shrubs will win over, especially clonal shrubs like Aesculus parviflora, will win over time over perennials. So my goal here is a big mass of Aesculus parviflora. However, I'm planting plants and there's lots of space in between them. So instead of just mulching the bed and waiting for the Aesculus to fill in and buy mulch every year and weed the mulch and have no birds doing anything in the mulch, the herbaceous landscape is seeded in, and there were a few live plants put in there, largely seeded in as a replacement for mulch. And over time, the shrubs expand, and as succession would dictate, beat out the meadow, and there you can see the last little meadow hanging in there. So really, seeded herbaceous meadow, and you're not going to plant Culver's root that takes 8 years to come in from seed because it's never going to have that opportunity. You're only going to plant the short and midterm species. How far do you go? The early long-term species? Well, if I put little plants 30 feet apart, I'd need longer meadow than I would if I planted them closer. Common sense always is a big part of this. You know, how far do you go in succession? But generally, you're talking about the Rudbeckias and the Monarda punctatas, which is dotted min. It's a biennial and the shorter-lived species. And it's important to understand the difference between clonal and clump shrubs. Clump shrubs, like viburnums, will coexist with herbaceous understory layer because they're clumps and they spread out up above and there's space underneath them. Whereas clonal shrubs have stems inches apart and basically dominate everything. So here you see an herbaceous landscape planted around clonal shrubs that is intended to be long-term as opposed to short-term between the clonal shrubs. So you're really like a quarterback. You know, if I'm throwing to a receiver, I don't throw the ball where the receiver is right now. I throw it to where that receiver is going to be. And there's a lot of that going on in this kind of thing. So let's look at the forest. 2 meadows here. One in the foreground is a long-term meadow that will be mowed once every year. How much time? 5 minutes? Okay. That will be mowed every year. But if you see off to the right, There were trees planted to extend the existing forest, and that's also planted with meadow. And in the first few years, those two meadows will look the same. But the meadow under the trees is only short midterm species because eventually, while it's sunny when the trees are planted, they're not big enough to shade the area yet. That's going to become shady. So the long-term species are basically woodland edge species under the trees. The short-term species in both landscapes are the same because they're both sunny short-term, and the long-term species in the open sunny landscape are the long-term meadow species. There you can see that short-term composition. Daisy fleabane, which I didn't plant, and Rudbeckia hirta, which I did. Again, this is at National Audiovisual Center in Culpeper, Virginia. It's a research facility for media, old film and things. And you can see the meadow here is basically a precursor to woodland. And in this case, there were a lot of live plants put in here. My inclination would be don't put live plants where it's not, don't put money into live plants where it's going to eventually turn into a woodland, and many of those will be shaded out. Clients wanted it. This was the main entrance to the whole thing, and they didn't want to wait till the woods and the trees were big. They said, for that area, we just want to plant it up with lots of live plants that'll have immediate effect, and if they fade out over time, so be it. You know, again, doing things that control plants indirectly, so to speak, as opposed to directly is kill it. Indirectly is do something to disfavor it. Now, this woodland edge, which was existing and the plantings were, the newer plantings in front of it, was all bittersweet and wild grape growing up the trees. So that was removed and killed. But those sunny edges where you're outside of the mowing of the meadow or the hayfield, but you're not in the deep shade yet, is where there's a lot of vegetative growth and often a lot of stuff that we consider weeds. So controlling sunlight is the key element here, not the day you plant it, but going forward. So this edge was planted to seal the light off from that woodland edge, to decrease the invasive plant pressure. And so you're seeing plants that grow densely and that grow all the way to the ground. Don't have you in the beginning of time here, but these are strategies for planting what we call mother colonies in woodlands particular. Meadows you can plant from seed because seed is the meadow species, generally the seed's viable for long enough to buy seed, get it, put it in the ground, and much longer than that. Many woodland herbaceous species, if not most, have very short viability and very specific needs in order to germinate. And so it's next to impossible to get a diverse, the kind of woodland herbs that you would like to see in a woodland from direct seeding. However, if you plant a plant, the seeds will drop on the ground when they are exactly ripe, and you will have germination from that. So this is a strategy, which I don't have time to go into, of planting mother colonies, managing temporarily cutting the invasive or weedy plants in between the colonies, creating a disturbance zone around each colony, which encourages the seeds to germinate at the edge of it, and then another disturbance zone, and each colony gets bigger. This is a pretty precise management strategy, and you have to know if you have a client that can handle this or not. You wouldn't just do it all the time. This is a landscape where you have the weeds are taller than the desired species, whether the desired species were planted or in this existing landscape. Cutting over top of the desired species, you're only cutting the weedy plant and never cutting the desired plants. Again, if you went out and hand weeded them or sprayed them, you'd kill them right away, but that's a lot of work. This way will favor the plants that were never cut over the ones that were. And here's an example of it. Here's blackberry and Mayanthemum, the native lily of the valley, Canada mayflower. And we wanted the mayflower, and we didn't want the blackberry. And so we're going to cut over top of the mayflower. In this case, with this plant, it's only a few inches in the spring over top of that plant, marking any tree saplings so they don't get cut. And here's what that landscape, this is actually a hedge-trimmed landscape in a way, because the spring we're mowing a couple inches over top of the Mayanthemum, and when you come to one of these fern patches, then it's weed whacked just over the top of it, and then back down once you get beyond it, whether it's mowing or mostly this was weed whacked really. You weed whack, go up to the fern, go over top of it, go down. Now, you'll notice there's Pennsylvania sedge coming up later in the year. So later in the season, when the sedge comes up, the mow height over the Mayanthemum goes up to the top of the sedge, which may be 12, 15, 18 inches, depending on the situation. So this is real precise stuff. And you can say, oh man, this is a pain in the neck to get people to do or to wrap around your head around or to put in management specifications, and they have to be specified. But Yeah, it's true. And there's a disconnect between what contractors understand and what I would like to specify. And a lot of these things, you know, we have to be involved directing contractors, or our people do it over a period of time. It's all about managing it in the early stages. And this isn't a planted landscape that you're looking here. This is just managing naturally occurring vegetation. But you know, looks like it could have been planted. It could have been a garden. You'll never see a natural, it's not a natural scene. You'd never see nature. You'd never see a solid stand of Meanthemum like that. I don't know, Patrick, you've been in a lot of landscapes. Have you ever seen that? It was not planted, you know. Nothing was planted. Nothing was sprayed. It was just understanding dynamics. And I'm going to end it here because I only had 2 minutes. But the key underlying strategy or thought process that I'll end with, which is similar to those 4 questions things I mentioned, it's like a key underlying thought process at the beginning of everything is, if I want to, that second, you know, the first question was, where's it going if I do nothing? Second was, what of that do I like, what do I don't like? And the third was, what can I do to head it in the direction I want? That third question can often be answered through this thought process. Identify the difference or differences between what you want to manage for and what you want to manage against, and exploit that difference. Now, in the case of the mow over the top, the difference was height. Blackberry is taller than Meanthemum or Pennsylvania sedge. So if I cut right at the top of the desired vegetation, and I'm always cutting the blackberry like 3 times a year, the blackberry does not go away in the first year, maybe not even the second year. But if that is occurring, taller plants usually have most of the foliage up high, and they're usually bare stems. So when you cut blackberry at 12 inches, you've removed all the foliage. Yes, it will resprout, but not if you're doing it 3 times a year over a period of 3 years. Eventually it gives up the ghost, not only because it can't survive that activity, but its competition, which is the sedge and Meanthemum and other things in there that we're doing, Geranium maculatum, and there's other things in there we're going over the top of too, are never getting cut. So we're favoring them over time. Identify the difference, exploit the difference. There are, you know, obviously I'm out of time, nor was I going to go into all the details of this, but there are certainly, that thought process can lead you to a lot of cool stuff where you can affect landscapes without having to be weeding or using copious amounts of herbicides. And I use herbicides selectively, but yes, I use them. I don't want to pretend I don't. There's a lot you can do, but it's all about understanding ecological process and putting it through the sieve of garden design and coming up with strategies that can work. And you know, I'll end this by saying this, you know, working in this manner, and to some extent clients that live in landscapes that are being treated in this manner have a different relationship to that landscape. And I know in my landscape at home, for sure it is, but the point is, you can, you know, there's a phrase used to be bandied around a lot, partnership with nature, and I always kind of thought, yeah, what does that really mean? Well, now I kind of understand what that really means, because these landscapes would be different if I didn't do anything, but they're not all me. And so you really start interacting with nature, and clients understand this, and you explain it to them, and they see things changing over time, and they can relate to that. So, you know, it's really a fascinating way to work, but not an easy way intellectually. You need to understand that there's a lot of thought that has to go into all phases of this, and if that thought isn't there, including management, that's when things can easily go awry. But it doesn't have to be that way, and it's pretty cool when it doesn't. Thank you. So I guess we're having thank you very much. We have a panel now, right? Should we go right into the panel, or should I ask? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm totally. Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hanging in there. I'm the anchor leg, so we're almost there. Rule 1, never follow anyone with a bunch of beautiful images, so here I am. But at least they didn't have a British accent. That's really deadly to try and follow up with. I realize I'm the only person standing between you and your Friday cocktail, so I'm going to try and get through this as quickly as possible. What Al asked me to talk about was innovation and research in a professional firm how we do it, how we felt done okay, how we've done badly, lessons learned. So instead of a bunch of projects, I'm going to show you pictures of garbage and some bullet points and things like that. So hang on, we'll get there. So our office is located in Philadelphia. We have about 80 people. We also have a small office in Los Angeles. Our firm was started by two academics at the University of Pennsylvania about 40-something years ago. And so research and innovation and inquiry have always been part of our office. All the partners teach, a lot of our staff teach, and so that kind of exploration is ingrained kind of in our nature. One of the things we've looked at doing was how can we better infuse research into our projects. And so I started as director of research back in 2007. I was kind of an army of one at that point. It was more of a paper title. Every time I tried to steal staff away to do something interesting, I was told no. So I ended up having to do it myself, which when I was trying to do other projects didn't work out so well. So we've tried a bunch of different models. Do we bring someone in? If you bring someone in who's a researcher, but they don't have staff, they can't really do anything. If you're trying to do it ad hoc with your staff, you end up, pirating staff from your other projects. Runs up a bunch of non-billable hours. Clients wonder why their work doesn't get done and so forth. So after a lot of trial and error, we ended up with essentially almost a collective community of research staff, if you will. It's just our design staff. And we set it up as something called Olin Labs. And so what it is it's an integrated community of designers. And the reason why we use that term is because we want the staff to be able to not only do their professional project work, but also at moments when they're free to dabble into areas of interest. So what we've done is we've divided the research into 5 areas that match our practice. Tech lab, people lab, eco lab, build lab, and design lab. And so they're fairly self-explanatory. Tech deals with essentially our technological support. People is more social metrics. Eco lab, self-explanatory. Build lab is lessons learned from projects. And then design lab is more design theory, culture, history, and so forth. And so the idea that we have a group that is loosely assigned to each of these 5, there's a lab leader, but it does allow the staff to dabble and move from one to the other as we take on small projects, or if a project has a particular theme that fits into one of these labs, they can do some extra research. And so by pulling from the whole design staff with some structure, it's allowed us to actually make a lot more progress. And it allows the staff to be more engaged with research as opposed to this little group that's kind of off in a corner having all the fun, and the staff looks on from a distance. The whole point was to be participatory. It's meant to encourage and let them have fun in the office and try some things that you wouldn't normally do on a project. So we have a series of modes of inquiry which are really focused around kind of how we do research. You can see the 5 labs kind of arranged, and they all share these kind of scales of inquiry. So research obviously is focused really on a problem, either at the project level, multi-project level, or externally with a collaborator. Development is somewhere in between, and then finally education is really more kind of at the staff level, sharing things within the staff and sharing things within projects and so forth. So a lot of times research projects, if you will jump different scales, and we may be like, well, yeah, we can run that all the way up and get an article out of it, or that's never going to get any farther than our knowledge base, or you know what, that's just going to answer a project question, that's fine, we'll park it and we may look at it later. So to store all that stuff, we invented what's called a knowledge base. It's really a glorified wiki. It's from open source software, although we are we're moving to a new one later at the end of the year. But this knowledge base was really the first thing that I did as director of research. Was I didn't want us to keep reinventing the wheel every time we looked at something or pulled some project data and so forth. So we've structured it around essentially our project numbers and the master format CSI format numbers. So the 2 are linked. And so essentially what we have is as we develop information, we key it and tie it. So between projects, you can see all the things. Searching by specific topics, you can find the things. Anyway, it's essentially a single repository, and it ties into our financial system, it ties into our marketing database and so forth. So it's meant to try and be a portal for everything, even though it's pulling from multiple systems. So the staff has really found it helpful because they know where to go, especially new staff that are coming in. And it also allows us to update. So this is a page, streetscape design. At the bottom, there may be like 50 articles attached. You can search not only the knowledge base page, but every single article that's attached by keyword. And it'll pull up the pages, and you can append it. You can follow who's editing it and so forth. So it essentially has allowed us to almost keep track of old employees, external collaborators, and so forth, because they're all listed on this page. So again, it's really for convenience. But now that we've developed, I think we're in about 8,500, 9,000 pages. And so it's started to become a repository that we're now starting to pull because we have enough kind of heft of information to start to do some interesting comparisons with our current projects. So I'm just going to walk through some research efforts that we've done in the office and just kind of describe how they support our practice and also how we can give back to the profession either through conferences or articles or share knowledge with our fellow practitioners. And just, again, to try and elevate design, to take the latest information from our scientific colleagues, our engineering colleagues, and pull them together to make the best environments that we can. So superset is a term we use for technical innovation, if you will. Al told me that the more I say innovation, for every time I say that, you get one CEU. So I'm going to try and get you your year's worth, kind of like giving out wings on It's a Wonderful Life, I guess. But anyway, so an innovation here is not that the tools themselves, it's more the combination of the palette of the tools. And so at the core is Rhino and Grasshopper. We're also integrating GIS and some other computational software, but we're using it all the way through from analysis, planting design, topographic review and testing, automation, you name it. The idea that these tools allow us to do things more rapidly, save time for the designers to actually design. So we're using it as an efficiency, as a test case, and because I'm the old guy in the office, not the oldest guy, thank God, but I'm the old guy, I get to tell all the designers, no, I don't believe that's actually what you developed, because we have the group that they like computational design, they like to make Zaha Hadid's shapes and SciArc fun stuff, but I'm like, well, let's look at it from the other end. Let's use the computational analysis to test fit and find errors and check it from the other direction. So we got the design, computational designers, and we have me, the rain on the parade guy. I'm like, oh yeah, that actually won't kill anybody. That will work. That's good soil depth. The wind is fine. So what we found is that by doing it from both directions, you avoid that black box problem of the kind of the algorithm or the computational routine that nobody questions. And the idea that we're doing it, but we're also checking it, and we're using the tools to do that to get to the correct solution faster. And so this is the Valco Town Center in Cupertino. It's about a half mile from that big round thing that just landed from space. And so this is a 30-acre green roof. I'll show you a picture of it. So this is it here. Okay, this is done by with Raphael Vignoli's office just down the road. And so it'll be one of the larger green roofs on the planet. And so it has, of course, Raphael could not make a flat roof. He had to make a curved roof. And so in some cases, we're exceeding 25%, which makes for planting and walking around and so forth and servicing challenging. So what we had to do is, as we were laying out our design, it was taking forever to try all the variations of path, appropriate slope below 5%, the transition for tree planting on the roof and so forth, because we were trying to keep the weight down. So anyway, we used the computational analysis to lay out the paths, find the topo, and so it would generate options, and then we'd go through with the hand of the designer and go, well, that's ugly, that looks good, that's my original design intent, and so forth. So again, the tool was not the designer. The tool was essentially the process that ran in the background to help us look at design more frequently and more rapidly and with a little more, I think, rigor in terms of how we did it. So it helped keep the soil profile down. We were looking at it from a ADA accessibility check, soil depth, weight, interaction with subsurface structural keys and so forth. The whole thing had to fit together. It's a really interesting ecosystem. It is a self-contained system. The version you're seeing here is a single unit over top of 16 buildings. This is the seismic damper for all the buildings. It's kind of a unique thing. The structural engineer was salivating over this one because this is going to be probably this iteration was going to be the most secure building in any earthquake environment. It was rated to over a 9.8 Richter event. And the idea is that it would be one of those things where they counterintuitively tell people to run onto the roof because that would probably be your safest place to be. Version 2 is now we're taking this and we're breaking it into 16 different roofs and stitching them together with more traditional seismic joints. Each building will be its own seismic damper, and so it's a more traditional element. It makes it a lot more challenging to produce kind of a single landscape. So again, the computational analysis and checking allows us to try and maximize the design while we're still meeting all the technical requirements. So again, that's the idea of superset in the office. So another one, soil to soils, this is one where so that's all internal. This one is with external collaborators. And as a professional services firm, trying to achieve research dollars through grants is really difficult because obviously we're not, eligible for the nonprofit grants and the academic grants and so forth. So we often have to partner with academics and government agencies and so forth. So the soil to soils research, I'm not gonna say that 3 times fast, put it that way, grew out of a project at the University of Washington, but it was at a very small scale. And the idea was, how can we look at a typical construction process in our work that starts to address some of the larger issues that you see here, which in soil really positioned to take on three kind of major topics in the world, if you will: the overconsumption of natural resources, the overburden of landfill, and also the desire from urban forestry and stormwater management to increase the use of green infrastructure within cities and projects. So soil to soil really is to create a healthy green infrastructure soil for urban environments that's using 100% renewable sourced material from recycled glass fines, mixed with Class A biosolids, also with on-site mineral soils and other renewable materials. The idea that you are not bringing anything to the site that's not renewable. So the idea, yes, we'll reuse the soil on the site, but rather than amending it with sands and gravels and things from off-site and other organic materials from off-site, the idea is we're taking all those external things from renewable resources and combining it with the stuff that's on-site to help preserve some of the farmland and so forth that these sites are damaging. So just a quick run through, you all know this. Obviously, the mining of materials is one of the most ecologically damaging. Sand and gravel is actually the most heavily extracted material on the planet, more so even than fossil fuels, and it creates a tremendous impact on the environment. Obviously, these types of materials are used in concrete and soils and so forth. And so the idea that if we can find an alternative that's already out there, we don't have the carbon impact of pulling this out, we don't have the environmental degradation of pulling this out, especially in areas, urban environments where they're easily affected, it's particularly in this area in mid-Atlantic and the southern New Jersey and Delaware areas. Combined with landfill overburden, as you all probably know, in early 2018, China started to refuse recycled materials. People don't realize how much they took from the United States. The recycling plants use them exclusively in many cases. This is the E.L. Harvey & Sons is a local recycler. This is the amount of bales of paper that he's been storing on site as a result of the cost impact from China reducing the number of tons of waste that they will process. So this 3,000 bales is going to cost him about $180,000 versus his typical recycling process. So this stat here, in the city of Philadelphia, managing recycles now has increased nearly tenfold in the last 11 months in terms of what this is going to cost. So therefore, obviously, recyclable materials are now no longer as economically viable an option as just dumping it in the landfill. So this, combined with our typical production of material going into landfill, is going to have a major effect. So again, what can we take from things that are already out there? Glass is one that is, obviously people recycle glass. It has some limitations in terms of how it can be recycled, the size that it can be recycled from. Again, a lot of this, from a convenience and economic point of view, causes it to end up in a landfill. So therefore, can we use this material as a substitute for some of the material we'd be extracting from quarries and so forth as a way to create soil that's viable for urban environments? There has been research done on this. Some of you probably have seen this. where the glass cullet is actually quite a viable alternative when mixed in the proper quantities. It was shown in dune plantings to actually outperform natural beach sediment. I'm not quite sure why, but that was the result. But the idea that, again, this is project we're talking about is taking information and research that's already been done and pulling it into a design and construction process and looking at ways that we can affect the outcome from a practical professional level. So how are we doing all this? Fortunately, I have help, so it's not just me. But the idea is we're teaming with the Ian McHarg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And so we're acting as kind of the central subcontractor to them. So they're the receiver of the grant money because they are an academic institution. Penn, like all academic institutions, takes their 42% cut of the grant. So it's, that's just the way things work. We talked to them about it. There was no budging on that. We are managing some of the other subcontractors, Phil Crawl, some of the horticulturists at Temple, and so forth. And so we are working with a larger steering committee, representatives from, again, from Penn, from Morris Arboretum, Rutgers, and the city of Philadelphia, to help guide the research. I'll show you the timeline again. These are not the most exciting graphics, but anyway, but it shows you the kind of the scope of what we're starting to do. Again, this grew out of this project at the University of Washington, but we wanted to take it more to a level of a scholarly rigor, wide range of use, and also test it in the toughest environment we could find. So we're just getting started with this. Obviously, we were setting this up earlier this year. We're into the beginnings of life cycle analysis. So what we're really doing is looking at this material from multiple stages. One is how easy is it to get, and what does it cost to turn it into something that's useful as an alternative to the natural materials that could be, and what's the carbon difference. So we have all sorts of super smart academics, working on those to isolate, the parts that are isolatable, how do they work as a system, and so forth. We're going to test them from a materials standpoint. We're going to do testing in the greenhouse, then we're going to go out and do testing actually in urban planted environments. Then we're going to look at that for a couple of years, then we're going to, again, report back and ideally come out with a process that can be used in as many places as possible. So here's one of the pictures of garbage. So the first thing was the waste audit to see what glass is actually produced, what's a realistic amount of glass that can be pulled from institutions and entities and diverted to be used, so it doesn't end up necessarily at a size that can't be reused. So this was a picture taken earlier this month over at Restaurant Row in Philadelphia near Penn. And so they're actually sorting through to see how much glass is actually produced on a daily basis. And combining with Penn's output, we're going to try and get an amount that can be reasonably expected to be generated on an annual basis and so forth. So again, this is the first step. We're working with them on this. This is actually really exciting given the range of projects we have in urban environments. If this turns out to be something viable and cost effective, it could be a real game changer in terms of environmental impact. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is something else we do. We did here for the first time, and we're starting to do more often in a more streamlined way, is a post-occupancy evaluation. So we have a project down in the DC area, Washington Canal Park. And so what we did was, it was a sustainable sites pilot project. It was one of the first urban parks that was a sustainable site project. And one of the credits we took was the monitoring of performance. Now, we've done projects where we've monitored our environmental performance or our financial performance, but we wanted to do a social performance, social metric performance. And so we use this as an excuse in the office for me to steal people from other projects to help accomplish this, because we had to, because we were part of the sustainable sites. So we looked at, actually I'm going to go through this in a little more detail, but we looked at it, we had an academic partner that helped us design the survey instrument. We had on-site observation, we had interviews and so forth, and we combined this into an understanding of how the park was functioning for the neighbors and the individual users. So actually I'm going to skip ahead because I have the more detail here. This will be a little easier to see. This is our summary page that my research coordinator put in, and I was like, okay, that's good, but I'm actually going to go to the other stuff. One thing about Canal Park is it's a self-contained stormwater management system. It has, on site, it captures 100% of the stormwater. It can hold almost 4.5-inch rain event. It captures it, stores it, cleans it, and reuses it for, there's a fountain, there's an ice rink, there's toilet flushing, and there's irrigation. So the site is very much interconnected. So it was the developer really wanted to make this a sustainable project, almost a showcase for their work. And so it really pushed the envelope in terms of there's geothermal wells, there's all sorts of things in there, but it creates about 28% of the energy demand is created on site. 95% of the water reuse is produced on site. And it also will attach to upcoming buildings that will be built to the east of it. And it's also receiving their stormwater and receiving payment for the management of that stormwater, which will allow them to go to zero lot line. And so therefore the park is also a little bit of an economic generator in terms of that function for those other 3 parcels. So just a couple of pretty images. I couldn't give you garbage shots and bullets the whole time. So there it is at night. So we had to rewrite Washington, D.C.'s health code based on borrowed information from Melbourne, Australia, about how to have contact with recycled water and the amount of cleaning that it took. At the end, we came down to a compromise. There had to be a small amount of chlorine added to the water for them to sign off on it. Not as much as you might expect, but it wasn't zero. So we got there in the end. We were hoping to not have to do that, but that was one of the things. And then they've agreed to basically there's human contact with recycled water, which is not a usual condition. So this is the summary of the Sustainable Sites Initiative point system. And this is where we ended up. Canal Park ended up with 164 points out of 250. So we were a 3-star project, which for an urban park is pretty good. And one of the things that we've noticed in doing, we do a lot of projects that are sites or LEED or so forth, is the fact that some of these credits they're easy to do, but some credits affect your ability to get other credits. So there's sometimes a sweet spot in what you choose to pursue or not pursue. And so the idea that, for example, urban soils, which was one, sites wanted a full restoration to pre-development chemistry and ecology and so forth for the soils. Problem is this site is an old bus depot. It's contaminated and there's a bentonite layer below it, so it's essentially sealed, so it's a brownfield. So there was no possibility of doing that. However, the fact that we actually are capturing probably like 4 times the amount of square footage in water, stormwater, instead of it going into the Anacostia River, our impact is much greater to the district than it would be in restoring those soils. So I think in terms of metrics, there's the point total, and then there's also what is the actual impact of the park or the project to the larger area. And so I think we've started to encourage the owners in terms of thinking of not only what are you doing from a marketing and PR point of view, but also from a true impact on the region and setting up something that can be replicated for surrounding projects. So why social performance? Why did we want to study that in detail? Well, it's really the central purpose of public space, obviously. It is also the least developed in sustainability literature, so we wanted for ourselves to learn how better to do that and how better to monitor it and how better to design for it in the future. It's present, but it is de-emphasized in the ratings, and it's very difficult to develop metrics. So obviously, it is essential in public space. You can see that's a Holly White experiment set up on the right-hand side and Bryant Park on the left. So again, it's been something that has been studied and is the basis of many of our designs in the room, but it is the least developed. And so essentially all of these say is there is either no consensus, there needs to be more work, or there's not very much done. It just says that it's the hardest thing to measure, so therefore people don't necessarily do very much of it. Within the rating system is, here it says it's 32 out of 250 points. It's actually not even that many. That's the entire human health. Some of those are things like lighting and sound. So in terms of actual social performance, social health, it's even smaller than the 32 points. So parks, use versus intent. I mean, one of the things we also wanted to understand was how do people actually use it and do they like to use it? So on the right-hand side, very typical. Both of these shots are Canal Park. You put water down, kids will come, right? That's kind of a no-brainer. We didn't realize, however, that when you put public art, underwear models will come out of the woodwork. So this apparently actually happens quite a bit. It's a very popular day when these models come out, and so we didn't take that as a typical use ratio of our park, so we discounted that. But anyway, it makes for a great photo. So anyway, but it's the type of thing that will show up in the park, and it's great that it shows up because David Hess has probably had no idea his sculpture was going to be used that way, but anyway, that's something you can put in his portfolio. So this is the sustainable sites section on human health and well-being. So for sites, to get the monitoring credit, you had to look at 5 of them. So we picked the 5 that most dealt with social performance and well-being within the neighborhood, then the park and the neighborhood relationship. So here's where Canal Park is in DC. This is the Nationals baseball stadium, the Navy Yard, and so forth. And out here is the Potomac. So it's very close to a metro. There's a metro stop right here. And this area's development has been going bonkers for about the last 10 years. And so it's a very kind of up-and-coming neighborhood. The design is 3 blocks. So there's a first block that's very urban, has the cafe, the fountain, there's a built-in ice rink. Middle block is more for kids. There's a scrim fountain, play area, and so forth. And the last block is kind of like the town green. It's a large programmable event space that's turf. And you can see the various shots of the different blocks, south block, mid, and north block. So movie nights and general, playing around in the fountain. The cafe is open a lot. That also happens to have skate rental and so forth in the winter. So the process we did was we started with our questions. Some were from sites, some were from the original RFP, and some were from our own internal. So we had to answer these. So we picked ones from sites to answer. We went back to the RFP to see how did we do. And then we also, for ourselves, we posed a bunch of questions based on how will this inform our design in the future. We did interviews, both with park staff as well as visitors. We did an actual survey, observations, time-lapse, and on the ground, and we did some environmental monitoring of temperature and sound and so forth. So we felt at the end we wanted to try and have each of these questions be answered with at least 2, if not more, observational methods to try and correlate what we saw. So we did multiple days throughout the year, throughout the seasons. We had actually pretty good response. 217 surveys turned in. People were actually amazingly candid, both about themselves and about the park, which was great. We were watching where everybody was going at different times of the year, looking at sound and where people were sitting in relation to that. And then we ended up with about 99 responses that we felt were valid enough, given that they were correlated from multiple observations. So the use patterns, the skating rink again down here, you can see winter is popular. Our 2, spring and fall, was a little light. So again, that was more, I think, to do with programming based on some of the things we heard. I think one of the most interesting things was the park is part of a larger system, and it makes sense if you think about it, because people, we're not forcing them to go here. There's some parks within about a half mile, and each one is a little bit different. So Canal Park was one of almost like a district of parks, and they all function together. We were the winter in the summer and the winter, and these guys actually had kid programming in the fall and the spring. So the X Park shifted, and Marion Park shifted the use to there, and so therefore we were, kind of, people would move around the neighborhood and use the different parks. You can see this is our population in the winter, didn't do so well in the fall. Again, I'll just go through these pretty quickly. We had a lot of verbal responses, tried to correlate those, Likert scale perceptions and so forth, created these. Obviously feeling safe, especially in a neighborhood that's under development, was very important. This was a fascinating one. We actually asked people, what they liked about the park, and of the responses, these were people seeking solitude and quiet, and these were seeking social interaction. And it's so interesting that they were actually sitting in the same place. This gives you the challenge of people. They're just kind of all over the place, right? So the idea that one person's quiet is another person's, whatever. And so that's why social performance is so difficult, because everybody, you might even change your mind from one day of the week to the other. Like, I think this is incredibly loud. Actually, it's not that bad. So it's an interesting dynamic to these observations, and it helps to really have a conversation versus just observing, so you understand kind of what's going on behind it. So at the end of all those questions, we went back and said, how did we do on each of these things? And really the education component and the environmental comfort were based on, we didn't get as much furniture and trees as we wanted, and we didn't have the program of education about the sustainable systems as much as we wanted. We did well, we think, in some of the other ones, especially the identity. Use levels, again, was seasonal and programmatic related. So at the end of the day, we spent a lot of time on this, but we also found out that people are really lazy. And the fact that everyone likes this 10-minute walk or half-mile radius to a park, that's way too big. So here, 20% of the users in the park came from 3 buildings. Okay, that'll give you an idea. And let's not forget, there's a metro like right there. So this is not like underserved from transit or anything. 36% within 2 minutes, 67% within 5 minutes, 78% came from within 10 minutes. So people they don't like to walk too far. When you come to with more specific program, the dog walkers, they're already walking anyway, right? So they're usually they don't mind going too far. But again, all of them were within 10 minutes. Lunch crowd, 83% within 5 minutes. I don't know who these people are. I'd love to have this lunch hour if I had 30 minutes to walk somewhere and back. But anyway, that, again, very close by. So the destination programming, like the skating rink, understandable because, within 2 hours, you're drawing people from outside in the suburbs of Virginia and Maryland, and there's a metro. So that's a logical thing. But for the most part, the parks come from a very small people shed, and they often work with other surrounding open spaces. The cafe was another destination again, but the farthest away was about 20 minutes. Kids play, people seeking out actual play space, they'll go a little bit farther. Fountain, again, it's a somewhat of a unique splash fountain, especially with the ice rink, within 30 minutes. Programming, driving social interaction, obviously you put the kids in the water, that's where they're gonna go. This was interesting about acquaintances in the park. Did you make any new acquaintances? 27% yes. This was, of those 27%, how did you meet? So kids and dogs, and then the park employees. And then there's this mysterious little thing down here. So we're offering no opinion on that response, but the park was open to everybody. So again, kids and dogs, that was the kind of thing. This is another interesting thing. Designers love to have precedents and explain to clients. This is Wagner Park here in New York, and this little corral is great for young kids because they can't run into the water or anywhere else, so they're kind of trapped in there, and parents love it. So we thought, wouldn't it be great to do that again? So there's Wagner Park and there's Canal Park. So we built this kind of half version of that with benches and everything, like, the parents will love it, the kids can't get anywhere, and so forth. So, of course, designers love to show people in their renderings or so forth. Well, here was our projected use, and they were basically everywhere but where we showed them. So here they were completely outside of it, and they almost never used it at all. Of course, they ran over to the fountain, or they were all running around where they weren't supposed to, right next to the street and everything. So precedents have limited utility if you aren't matching things exactly. So this is the last couple slides. I think one of the most important things for us, this neighborhood's been under development for a while. The park was one of the first things to go in. If there's any place in Washington that is at risk of displacement and challenges with development, it would be this area around National Stadium. You can see the income level went from an average of 11,000 to 89,000. So what we were most concerned about was, did this have an impact on park use? And so first, we were encouraged by this, that everyone felt welcome. I think the park was designed for lots of different people. We tracked the income, age, and other elements from the neighborhood, as well as visitors to the park. So you can see they're tracking pretty closely neighborhood and the park visitors, same distribution of income, same distribution of demographic, of age, and so forth. So that, combined with some of the input, led us to some findings. I know we're near the end of the time, so I'm not going to go through all these, but we felt that the park was performing its job as being a common ground. The restaurant had been through 3 owners. The price point was the key thing. When they finally got to the right price point for everybody, people started to use that more regularly. But the park, we were very happy to see, seemed to be a welcome and destination for everybody. And so that's it for me. So, thank you.
And now I'd like to ask the speakers to come up for the panel, which is going to last about a half hour. And is this one working?